Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Breaking Down the Wall, Essential Shifts for English Learners' Success. Just to let you know, if you have any questions for the presenters during the meeting, please send them using the chat function. Please also note, because of the length of the meeting today, we won't be able to answer your questions right now, but we will get back to you and everyone with the answers to all questions at a later date in writing. Now, what I'd like to do is turn the presentation over to Dan Albert from Corwin to introduce today's presenters and to talk about today's presentation.
Thank you, Jeff. I want you to imagine breaking down the wall. In this presentation and in our recently published book, we use this metaphor to signify the removal of the many barriers that prevent our multilingual learners from realizing their infinite potential. Next. I'm Dan Albert, publisher and program director for Corwin Press, and it is my honor to have served as the editor of Breaking Down the Wall. I'm also thrilled to be sharing the spotlight with 7 of our 9 co-authors. Next slide. The official birthday of Breaking Down the Wall is January 19th, 2017, the day before the presidential inauguration. We convened in Santa Barbara in the midst of torrential downpours, and while our intentions reflected a counter-narrative of hope, our mood was more of trepidation. The events leading up to the 2016 election were already unsettling, and the early indicators of what was to come were ominous. With that said, we managed to move beyond our collective anxiety, and the vision that was formed in that hotel conference room was spectacularly beautiful and pure. Next slide. The work that was born out of our collaboration captured the best of our respective imaginations. However, none of us could possibly imagine the course of the next 2 years. None of us could imagine a world in which the notion of a post-truth era was no longer an academic conceit, but instead is part of our daily reality. Next slide. The failure of the imagination may be an old story, and the lessons of history appear to have taught us very little, yet the powerful resistance movement that emerged as early as the day after the inauguration gives us strength. I like to think that Breaking Down the Wall is but one reflection of this resistance. And yet, just when we think it can't possibly become more surreal, the national fever dream simply intensifies. Nobody could imagine the rhetoric of medieval moats crawling with alligators and snakes. Nobody could imagine a world in which families are broken up and babies are placed in cages, in which our legacy of tired, poor, and huddled masses has been supplanted by a desolate landscape. Nobody could imagine a class photo in which children, our children, greet their futures with a Nazi salute. And nobody could imagine a world in which white nationalism is reified, sanctioned, and celebrated. And nobody could imagine how our national policies now threaten to put our most marginalized learners into even greater jeopardy. I think it's critically important to leave you with a far more hopeful vision. I want you to imagine Santa Barbara, one of the loveliest spots on the California coastline, in a different light. What does it mean to reimagine and cultivate a landscape? The rain has stopped. The temperature is close to perfect. The Pacific Ocean is a deep, almost unimaginable shade of azure. The mountains above the coastline are verdant in this perfect spring day. And in this perfect place, in this perfect moment, I want you to envision a world in which we rise to become our best selves in the interest of our emergent bilingual and all children. especially those who have been oppressed and underserved. And most importantly, I want you to believe that together we can do this. This is just a quick overview of the 9 shifts that we're going to cover today. Next, please. And I'd like to pass the talking stick to our first presenter, Diane.
Hi, this is Diane Stair-Fenner, and my colleague Debbie Zakarian and I will talk about from a deficit-based to assets-based approach. Next slide, please. How many of us have responded to our English learners by looking at their progress learning English, comparing their performance on standardized tests of reading and mathematics and their rates of graduation with their non-English learner peers, and lamented what we might perceive as the problem, that ELs are not learning English fast enough? How many of us think about what our students don't possess as opposed to what they do inherently possess, or may have developed as a result of being reared in a language in addition to English? Next slide. What happens when we move from a deficit-based approach that looks at what students are not doing to an assets-based one that's wholly focused on identifying and capitalizing on the many strengths and assets that our students, their families, our schools, and our communities possess? Research in psychology, child development, and education shows the critical importance of looking beyond what we might perceive as missing or lacking or a deficit in our students so that we can operate from the strengths and assets that they possess and that are already there. This perspective calls for us to take action in using a student's home language and cultural ways of being and acting as playing an essential role in their academic, social, and emotional development. Let's look at an example illustrated here in our photos. One example is a parent who goes to the local laundromat weekly and has their child support the cleaning process by measuring the soap, folding the laundry in thirds, and all the while supporting the child's mathematical thinking. Next slide. Thanks, Debbie.
Thanks, Diane. I'm Debbie Zakarian. Welcome, everyone. An assets-based perspective values students' home languages and cultures and sees them as foundations for future learning. It recognizes that parents are involved in their child's education and in many different and perhaps unrecognized ways. It provides multiple opportunities to honor students' cultural and linguistic backgrounds and incorporates what students already know into their teaching. It acknowledges and recognizes that as humans, we all engage in interacting with others, and we learn by interacting with others. Children develop by interacting with their family's community, their school community, including their teachers, peers, administrators, and others, as well as their local and even their broader community. We have a much better chance of supporting our students' success when we focus on engaging students and interacting across all of these communities. In short, an asset-based perspective allows all of our students and our students' humanity to shine through. Next slide. Our call to action for engaging in this shift is centered around 5 practical strategies to help make this transformation. First, take time to build relationships with families as they enroll their children or as we meet with them by asking questions that sincerely shows our curiosity to get to know their assets. Questions such as, what are things you enjoy doing with your child and what are your hopes and dreams for your child are really important to ask if we're ever to build an asset-based approach. Second, engage the school community in building an understanding and relationships with English learners. An example is a teacher who works in partnership with colleagues to welcome new English learners and supports them in telling their personal narrative to one of their teachers to help everyone become familiar and care about our students. Third, challenge colleagues' thinking to help them see our English learners' assets. When you confront a deficit-based perspective, try to find out why the colleague thinks that way and gently probe for more information to learn about misconceptions. Fourth, use storytelling as a way to highlight English learners' strengths. Have students write stories about their backgrounds to the degree that they're comfortable and share their successes with the school and community, such as when a former English learner becomes a school valedictorian. Fifth, build upon the assets of students' home languages and literacies. Use multicultural resources in the classroom and ensure English learners and their families see themselves reflected in our hallways, school offices, and libraries. These 5 practical strategies form our call for moving from a deficit-based to an asset-based approach for breaking down the wall. Next shift.
Good evening, this is Sean Slack, and the shift that Marguerite and I worked on, one of them is from compliance to excellence. Next, please. Over the last 15 years, school districts have spent many years working on accountability and guidelines with shifting, changing at hand, the accountability moving around the board. States have more flexibility now. Monitoring, reporting, and other processes are now even more required. But that may change at any time. So with those fluctuating standards and accountability pieces in mind, our increasing population, higher risks for our students, we must work on going beyond the minimum expectation and move the expectation to one of excellence. Compliance equals an adequate amount of service, just enough. But I, for one, am not satisfied with good enough. Good enough isn't okay with me, it isn't okay with Margarita, and I imagine it isn't okay with anyone listening. So with that in mind, this chapter will help guide your thinking towards excellence. In this chapter, we offer a few keys for excellence based upon the US DOJ and the Office of Civil Rights guidelines to quickly and accurately identify L's, effectively individualize programs, assure that you have highly qualified instructional and support staff for the individualized programs, be able to provide equitable access to all curricular and extracurricular programs that are a warm, welcoming, all-encompassing environment that is indistinguishable and inclusive with programs and services for all students, for duly identified learners, for anyone who needs the support. We want to support our language acquisition in the general classroom for everyone, regardless of their language learning status, level of service. We'll show you how to collect and analyze data showing success and support, how to plan and conduct a yearly evaluation with refinements key to the changing student population. And finally, to ensure meaningful communication with family, parents, and guardians. And why would we do this? Because the faces that are on your screen are only a few of those that you see every day. We're doing this for them because they want to be and deserve excellence. They want to be doctors, nurses, firefighters, lawyers, judges, chefs, bakers, mechanics, researchers, artists, and so on. However, excellence isn't easy, speedy, or simple, but it can become a habit. Yes, it takes time and persistence. If you don't get it right the first time, you have to refine and try again. Excellence takes determination and work. Just ask Aristo Sham, the classical piano prodigist, Shaun White, the Olympic snowboarder, David Ortiz of baseball fame, or even Simone Biles, who now has gymnastics moves named after her thanks to her strive for excellence. Next, In the end, don't we all want to be the Jimmy Choos of education, the Bentley, the Tamburini Masimoto of motorcycles, the Krugerrands, the gold standard of education? This is the only list that we should be checking off: excellence. With the components and concepts in this book, excellence is what we're going for.
Thank you. And Tanya, this is Diane again. Tanya and I are going to be talking about from watering down to challenging. Next slide, please. Ensuring access to rigorous and intellectually rich learning opportunities is essential for raising multilingual learner achievement. It's also essential to disrupt inequitable outcomes with high expectations, strategic scaffolds, and collective efficacy to ensure programs and instruction accelerate, not remediate learning. To excel with rigorous academic content, English learners need access to rigorous academic learning experiences. Engagement in daily opportunities to listen, speak, read, and write about grade level topics, concepts, and complex texts is essential for learning both grade level content and the academic language that's necessary for school. Challenge is essential, and watering down, we know, is problematic. And we know that our students, all of our students, need access to content as well as academic language learning. And let's see how next. So in our call to action, we believe that to disrupt inequitable outcomes for ELS, we have to transform our mindsets, our programs, and our practices. And we'll share 3 ways, and Tanya will go into a little bit more detail next. The first is to shift all educators' mindsets so that they operate from an assets-based perspective, like Debbie and I talked about, and set high and attainable expectations for ELS. The second is to position ELS for success by creating programs and schedules that facilitate English learners' access to challenging content. And third, we want to ensure that all teachers use and lose scaffolds strategically to appropriately support and challenge English learners. A courageous collaboration built on a framework of humility that Tanya will talk about, curiosity and openness to keeping the focus on our students is necessary across all 3 components in order for them to be fully realized.
Thank you, Diane. So the first action to really shift from watering down to challenging, we have to shift mindsets. As Diane talked about, from deficit to asset, but one of the actions we can take to shift mindsets from low expectations to high expectations is to engage educators in collaborating to calibrate expectations. Part of this work is the inside-out work of uncovering biases and understanding implicit biases that are disadvantaging specifically our multilingual learners and students of color. But together we get very specific when we can focus on what are our goals, what does success look like in terms of content and language, and collaborate together to get clarity of what our goals look like. That's one powerful action to translate the vision of mindsets of high expectations into reality. Next. Another call to action that we emphasize in this chapter is a call to action to really focus on our programs. Designing our programs where when we provide supports for multilingual students, we are not providing unnecessary segregation. That our supports don't silo and marginalize multilingual learners in ways that deny access to rigorous core learning. Next. Next, thank you. So this also means, previous slide, thank you. This also means that in our classrooms, we're building the capacity of all teachers to actively engage students and teach at high levels, and to know that English language learners are part of that core general education tier 1 teaching, to design our programs so that students are supported, effectively supported to succeed with challenge, and that our programs by design ensure equitable access. Next. This, of course, takes deep and courageous collaboration among all adults at all levels of the system to have a clear focus on where we're going for students. What is the outcome goal we want to reach for students? And based on that goal for students, we're reflective about our practice to say, are we getting there and what will we change to help students succeed? Next. The third specific action that Diane mentioned is to shift to use scaffolding strategically. This is a shift from the silver bullet to verbs, our actions, which are our mindsets and our actions in the classroom, to reflect. Reflect, we engage our students, we observe, we support our students, and reflect, is this getting our students where they need to go? This is fundamentally different. Previous slide, please. This is fundamentally different than approaches that say, oh, you have English learners, you must do this one strategy, or you must do this set of strategies. Next. Thanks. So when we're courageous in our commitment to creating access and high expectations for every student, that is when we can realize our vision of true opportunities in our schools. Next.
Thank you so much. This is Andrea Honigstad representing Maria and myself, sharing with you how to move from isolation to collaboration. Let me walk you through some scenarios. Next slide. Right now, there is a teacher somewhere who's trying to differentiate instruction. Next slide, please. For his English learners, and he's unsure if the impact his efforts are going to lead to higher student learning. Next. There's a teacher somewhere who is racking her brain about how to fairly assess an English learner's work. Next. Right now, there is another teacher somewhere who has figured out ways on his own how to reach English learners through a lot of trial and error, yet that information remains in the confines of his own classroom. Next. Right now, there's a principal somewhere who has a large influx of English learners and feels unprepared to support her staff and the community through this change. Next. Right now, there is a child somewhere who is confused by the routines and expectations in his class, which are so different from what he was used to in his previous school. But let me switch the conversation. What if? What if teachers could regularly collaborate to analyze the academic and linguistic demands and differentiate instruction accordingly? What if English learners and grade and content teachers consistently work together to assess their students' work and plan instruction that enhances both content and language and literacy development? What if administrative teams work together to nurture teacher leadership and advocacy and create the time and space for sustained teacher collaboration? And what if students lost their labels and were grouped for instruction that engages them in shared exploration to build knowledge and expertise in content, academic language, and literacy? Imagine the power of collaboration. When Erin and Lisa regularly meet to reflect on building their partnerships. When Nick and Dean co-plan their high school social studies lessons and positively influence the learned experiences of all their students while fostering collaborations among them as well. When Joel and Leah discuss their impact on English learners in their co-taught high school math lessons and how flexible grouping supports the development of math skills and language skills at the same time. When Danielle and Nicole, after 10 years of co-teaching together, have become a district model for working with all levels of English learners in an integrated model of instruction. When Amy offers individualized instruction to English learners without removing them from their classrooms. When Zeba and Farah participate in joint professional development around leadership support for the instruction of English learners. And most of all, it's all about the students. When our English learners thrive in Andrea and Michael's 7th grade science class, where peer interaction and support is the dominant way to learn. Thank you.
This is Ivania Soto, and the shift that Tanya and I worked on was from silence to conversation. The premise of this chapter is if we create student-centered classrooms that allow for student voices, we can engage and motivate everyone within a system. The systemic implementation of equitable, collaborative conversations will benefit all of us. Next slide. One strategy that we focus on in this chapter is ELL shadowing as a way to disrupt silence. In classrooms today, ELs are spending most of their day silent, compliant, and invisible. A national study by Diane August of the Center for Applied Linguistics suggests that ELs spend less than 2% of their school day in academic talk. In my work with ELL shadowing over the last 16 years, I'm finding that ELs are now spending 5 to 10% of their school day in academic talk. And although this is better than 2%, it is still not enough. These percentages are particularly problematic for a group of students that needs academic language practice in order to become proficient in English. Research by August and Shanahan suggests that academic oral language is also the foundation of literacy for ELs. So we are not in vain by requiring our ELs to practice academic discourse in the classroom setting. In fact, ELs absolutely need it to survive in school, and educators must intentionally plan for it, or it won't happen. And my colleague Tanya is next.
Thank you, Ivania. So we talk about 3 shifts, 3 calls to action specifically. One is to replace hand raising with structures and scaffolds for student conversations. As Ivania mentioned, being intentional in planning and designing those interactions so students communicate with one another in small groups, in partners, and we stop the initiate, response, evaluate default of classrooms. Stay at this slide, please. Another key shift is that we make conversations routine in everyday teaching. So if you're in the role where you're building the capacity of teachers, it has to go beyond just training people in the strategies. You also need to build time to plan into planning those structures and academic conversations connected to the curriculum, to what teachers are teaching every day. So those conversations become routine. So teachers change habits, and we need to support each other collectively, collaboratively to shift those habits together. Next slide. To truly impact academic conversations and academic talk in the classroom, we need data, and we need to prioritize observation data. Ivania Soto mentioned the shadowing protocol that has been highly successful in her work is a protocol for using observation data to get very specific about who's talking and who's not talking. And you can use that to build a strong call to action, a sense of urgency to see that where you are. You can also use it to measure change and the impact of your professional learning. And in this picture, you see from my work in observation inquiry is where you build observation of lessons that teachers have co-planned together into a cycle of inquiry. So we want to use, if you're doing professional learning communities or any data-driven process, don't leave observation data out of it. Make observation data a priority and ask those critical equity questions. Who's talking? Who's silenced? What are English language learners doing in that conversation? How are they engaging in the conversation? Next. So when teachers and educators consistently plan for student-to-student collaboration and carefully align it with the standards, learning intentions, and success criteria, it's powerful for all students. When we can make it so our classrooms are spaces for equitable, democratic dialogue, where students learn to listen to multiple perspectives, to speak with courage and voice. Imagine the power that we create where our students learn to truly listen across difference, to think beyond what they already know, and collaborate for a better world. Next shift, thank you.
Hello, this is Margarita Espino Calderon, and Sean and I wanted to emphasize in this particular shift the need to go from language to language literacy and content. Next. So It's not just the ESL teacher who teaches language anymore, nor is it the reading teacher who teaches only reading. Neither do content teachers teach only content. In fact, every teacher in the school needs to be prepared to teach language, literacy, and content. Here we see a Spanish teacher and a technology teacher who are pre-teaching key vocabulary before their students begin to read. Next. And history teachers also teach vocabulary tiers 1, 2, and 3, words before they start their lessons during each classroom. Next. English language arts teachers create meaningful activities for ELs. Next. And all teachers use the writing process of drafting, editing, revising in every classroom because principals expect to see the writing process posted as we see here in the library. Next. Newcomers arrive daily. Newcomers will continue to arrive. This was before when deported parents could hug their children in the middle of the Rio Grande for 3 minutes, once or twice a year. Next. Now, they only touch through a fence, through a wall. And the students go back to schools the next day. Therefore, social emotional learning needs to be part of everybody's training, everyone in the school. Next. Fortunately, ELs are resilient. These are new citizens who are already up and coming famous journalists, high-end department store managers, and other future contributors to our society. Next. All ELs can be successful if all teachers in a school attend professional development focused on ELs. Why PD for all? Well, because when general education teachers do not provide quality instruction for ELs and all students, they fall through the cracks and become long-term ELs. When EL interventions are not aligned with general education, nor address language, literacy, and content, then they wind up in special education, or worse, they drop out of school. Next. Thus, the whole school needs to retool through whole school professional development, as we see here from one high school in Loudoun, Virginia. Every year, more and more schools are becoming whole school for ELs PD. Next. After administrators go through the same training, 3 days of training with their teachers, they attend 2 additional days on how to support their teachers and how to support their ELs. Next. The district specialists and administrators also attend the 5 days and plan together with the school on how to conduct follow-up coaching, teachers learning communities, and the overall changes, because yes, there have to be changes, and it takes a whole school to become a language, literacy, and content school in all subjects and in all classrooms. Next shift.
This is Andrea Honigsfeld again, representing Margot Gottlieb and myself, talking about from assessment of learning to assessment for and as learning. The premise of our chapter is that it is imperative to develop linguistically and culturally sustainable classroom assessment practices in which teachers and students co-plan and co-construct performance tasks and use mutually agreed upon criteria for success. Next. The shift Margot and I advocate for is a move from assessment of learning to be the most important source of data to providing evidence for what students can do through assessment for and as learning. And this shift is critical. Historically, inequitable assessment practices have led to references to our students as long-term else, struggling readers, students at risk, all of which reinforce what English learners, multilingual learners lack. This type of deficit mindset must be replaced with a more learner-oriented stance that also encourages teachers to collaborate in co-planning, co-implementing, recording and interpreting assessment information. Next. So Margot and I take a sociocultural stance of assessment that is descriptive of what teachers and students do on an ongoing basis to gather and share information to improve teaching and learning. Assessment of learning is a snapshot in time. As a series of socially constructed activities, assessment for learning is considered a process that is integral to and embedded in the instructional cycle, not separated or divorced from it. Assessment for learning ensures that students have choice and voice throughout the teaching learning cycle. And assessment as learning gives students their much needed space, recognition, and stature within the educational system. It leverages and builds upon our students' languages, cultures, backgrounds, and experiences. Assessment as learning helps students become more autonomous, self-directed, self-regulated learners. It is the development of student agency and self-advocacy that drives assessment as learning. So I would like to share a few success stories. Emily Francis is a high school English language development teacher in North Carolina who welcomes her multilingual learners back to school with an activity similar to what you see on the screen. Her work inspired this tool that Margot and I adapted based on what Emily does with her students. She invites her students to select with or can-do descriptors for specific key language uses, language domains, and establish language goals. The students generate I can statements to share what they are confident in doing, and I will statements that exemplify ambitious but attainable goals for themselves. The next example is Katie Topple, an elementary English language development teacher from Oregon, who takes a holistic approach when she invites her students to answer the following 4 questions for individual goal setting. My language glow is, my language grow is, one goal I have at school this year is, and one goal I have outside of school this year is. Katie also uses various tools that invite students to continually reflect on what areas they need improvement and what evidence do they have of meeting or exceeding some standards. Next. Claudia Leon, a middle school English as a new language teacher from New York, uses a simple checklist that you see on the left side of the screen. In this tool that's inspired by resources published on the engageny.org website, she ensures that quick writes are guided by rigor and relevance to the grade level English language arts standards for her students. She frequently invites her students to reflect on their language. Instead of saying, I don't know, what else can they say as they reach out to their peers? So finally, we're inviting you in this chapter to consider this balancing act, how to take a balanced approach to assessment and learning, how to shift to an asset-based philosophy and practice regarding English learners, multilingual learners. As a result, our students will feel more empowered as they gain a sense of ownership, agency, and advocacy for their own learning. Thank you.
This is Ivania Soto again. The shift that Margot Gottlieb and I worked on was from monolingualism to multilingualism. And the next, please. The premise of this chapter is multilingualism and multiculturalism are central to students' identities and should be a national priority. The cognitive and social-emotional benefits of multilingualism have long been supported by significant bodies of research. Moreover, as we prepare our citizenry for participation in a global economy, the ability to function in multiple languages and cultures has become increasingly urgent. Next. We want to open this segment with a vignette about a student whose multilingualism was valued and recognized with the seal of biliteracy in order to reinforce the notion of viewing multilingualism as an asset. Next. Julian is an EL and a senior in high school who received the seal of biliteracy, which means that he has achieved a level 4 overall on the English Language Proficiency Assessment for California, completed all of his English language arts requirements for graduation with an overall grade point average of 2.0 or above in those classes, and passed the Spanish Advanced Placement exam with a score of 3 or higher. In his freshman year, he connected well with his Spanish teacher, Mrs. Fox, who encouraged him to continue with his Spanish for Heritage Speakers classes for the next 3 years. Mrs. Fox noticed that Julian's Spanish was a strong point, and she told him about the seal of biliteracy, which was a way for him to be acknowledged for his strong primary language skills. Julian liked the idea of being acknowledged at graduation for his bilingualism and biliteracy. So he met with his high school counselor and told her that he was interested in meeting this goal, which she assisted him with pursuing. Julian says, "It gives you a motive to finish. Before I was like, my Spanish is used at home and in the community, but now I see how I can use it to benefit my career goals as well as my community." Next. Julian's story is one where several educators, both a Spanish teacher and academic counselor, viewed his multilingualism as an asset and assisted him with the goal of obtaining the seal of biliteracy. In this way, multilingual learners' linguistic and cultural assets are to be accentuated, not eradicated, both in school and in life. As was suggested by his interview, Julian's goal is now to use his multilingualism in his career and to give back to his community. Shifting our philosophies from one of monolingualism to multilingualism allows us to springboard students' experiential base to further their development and honor their multilingualism. Next. In 2011, California became the first state to formally introduce and enact legislation creating the seal of biliteracy, and over 10,000 graduates received the seal in the spring of 2012. As of 2019, 37 states and the District of Columbia have approved legislation creating and governing seals of biliteracy. Although California led the way with the seal of biliteracy in 2011, they have not always been leaders in multilingualism. In fact, it was only in 2016 that the state overturned Proposition 227, a restrictive English-only policy. In this chapter, we take a look at California as a case study in English only to multilingualism. Next. Specifically, California offers as an example that other states can learn from, as it is the nation's most populous state with the highest percentage of ELs of any other state. California is also home to a significant percentage of long-term English learners, with 59% of all ELs at the secondary level being identified as long-term English learners. California's history with bilingual education has not always been a positive one, as few ELs were instructed in bilingual settings over the past 20 years. Despite 1.4 million students enrolling as English learners, the number of these students receiving bilingual education dropped precipitously from 30% in 1998 to less than 5% in 2013, again due to Prop 227, a restrictive English-only policy. And was heading in the direction of a monolingual English-only state, citizens overwhelmingly passed Prop 58 in California. Next. Under Prop 58, ELs and proficient English speakers in California can once again be honored for their languages and have an opportunity to become bilingual and biliterate. California's current comprehensive, large-scale, and well-funded implementation of Prop 58 is about righting a historical wrong. Next shift.
Hi, everyone. This is Debbie Zakarian again. Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm in the wrong spot. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Jeff. This is Debbie Zakarian again. I had the pleasure of co-writing this chapter with Maria Dove. Our chapter focuses on what it takes to move from nobody cares to everyone and every community cares, an important goal for all of us. Next slide, please. We begin our chapter with the student Javier, a student who's taught using conventional methods of evaluation and instruction that don't look for the strengths and assets that Javier possesses, and that he and all students possess inherently or as a result of facing experiences that are quite different from middle-class norms, such as students and families who have not had the privilege of a formal education, or the epic number who've experienced trauma, violence, and chronic stress. Next slide, please. As important as it is to use an everyone cares mindset and mental mindset, research shows that most educators have not had formal training in college or in professional development after college about working with English learners, including the high percentage who live in extreme poverty, as well as the epic number living with adversity, as well as those who've not developed the academic language and literacy and social emotional communication skills that are needed to be successful in school and beyond. It doesn't mean that our students are broken. They have many strengths and assets that require that we learn about them, be curious about them, and use strategies that support our partnering with them because we care for and care about them. Next slide, please. Asking questions that looks for students and families' assets and strengths, such as these questions. What are Javier's special interests? What are some things that you particularly enjoy about Javier? What are some things that you enjoy doing as a family? And we welcome family involvement. How were you involved in your child's prior school? Questions such as these help us in building a caring and successful programming and partnering with families from the start. Next slide, please. It calls for us to cast aside our preconceived beliefs, to be curious and open-minded by asking questions and tapping into assets in ways that support students' learning and families' involvement. For example, when a school learned that a mother is a welder, she was invited to her son's high school chemistry class to demonstrate the process of thermal reaction and show how heat is used to weld pipes together. Next slide, please. To make this essential shift to everyone cares, it calls for us to train educators in university and district settings to work with English learners using a mindset that has an expectation of a positive outcome, that unconditionally accepts students and families, builds a community of trust and partnerships on behalf of students' social, emotional, and academic growth, consistently uses strategies to partner with families of English learners, looks for assets and strengths, avoids stereotyping and making assumptions, and provides all pre- and in-service educators with practice opportunities to use such strategies. Next slide, please. We can do this by creating classroom-based events that are intended to first build relationship with families, second, showcase student learning, third, draw from the rich and plentiful resources of families, and fourth, create a home school culture of learning. These types of events call for us to look away from our traditional parent-teacher conferences, open house, and curriculum practices to ways that involve our students and our community. An example is a school that is eager for all of its students to graduate and go to college. They partner with a local community college and involve alumni English learners and community college instructors to come to their high school to meet with students and their families to learn about and even experience the community college experience, so it demonstrates that level of commitment and caring. Next slide, please. We can only do this when we are willing to move to a place where everyone and every community cares about our students. Moving to a place where everyone and every community cares shows great promise for all of us today and in the future. And there is no better time to break down the wall and make these essential shifts for our English learners' success than right now. Thank you.